I never believed that a marriage could fall apart in a single night. People always say relationships break slowly, little by little, like a wall cracking over time. But in my case, it felt like everything collapsed at once, like a building that looked perfectly stable from the outside until the moment it suddenly gave way. The strange thing is, the night that changed everything started like the most ordinary evening of my life. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of quiet fall evening when the rain taps gently against the windows and the house feels almost too still. My wife Linda had gone upstairs early complaining about a headache. That had been happening more often lately. We were both in our mid-50s, and life had slowed down in ways I never expected when I was younger. The kids were gone, the house was quiet, and the days blended together in a rhythm that felt safe, predictable, and comfortable. Our daughter Emily had moved to Arizona years earlier with her husband and their 2 little boys. Our son Daniel worked in Chicago and rarely came home except during holidays. That left just Linda and me in the house we had lived in for more than 20 years. Sometimes the silence felt peaceful. Other times it felt like something was missing. But I believe that was simply part of getting older. After nearly 3 decades of marriage, Linda and I had built a life that most people would call stable. We had weathered job losses, financial struggles, the stress of raising teenagers, and the painful illness that took my father during the winter of 2015. Through all of it, we stayed together. Or at least, that's what I believed. That evening I was standing in the kitchen making a cup of tea when I noticed Linda's purse sitting on one of the dining chairs. That might sound like a small detail, but if you had known my wife the way I did, you would understand why it caught my attention. Linda was the most organized person I had ever met. Her purse always stayed on the dresser in our bedroom. Her keys hung on the same hook by the door every single day. Her shoes lined up neatly in the closet like soldiers standing in formation. Linda believed routines kept life from falling apart. So seeing her purse sitting there in the kitchen felt strange, like finding a clock on the wall that suddenly stopped ticking. I probably wouldn't have thought much about it if the phone inside the purse hadn't started vibrating. The sound echoed faintly through the quiet kitchen. At first it buzzed once. Then again. And then a third time, each vibration lasting just long enough to make me glance in that direction. I tried to ignore it. Everyone deserves privacy, and in 27 years of marriage Linda and I had never been the type of couple who checked each other's phones. We trusted each other. That was always one of the unspoken rules of our relationship. But the buzzing didn't stop. After the 4th vibration the screen lit up just enough that I could see part of the message. I wasn't trying to read it. I swear I wasn't. But the phone was half sticking out of the purse, and the words appeared right there in front of me as if someone had deliberately placed them in my line of sight. I miss you already. I froze. For a moment I just stood there staring at the screen, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. Messages like that don't just appear randomly. They belong to a certain kind of conversation, the kind people don't usually have with coworkers or distant relatives. I told myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe it was a friend going through a divorce. Maybe someone was being overly dramatic about something trivial. But before I could convince myself of any of those possibilities, the phone vibrated again. Another message appeared. Tonight meant everything to me. Something inside my chest tightened in a way I can't fully describe. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was confusion, mixed with a quiet fear that I didn't want to acknowledge. I picked up the phone without really thinking about it. The screen was locked, but the messages were still visible in the notification bar. They were from a contact saved under a name I had never seen before. Michael. I stood there for several seconds trying to remember if Linda had ever mentioned someone by that name. Nothing came to mind. And the more I stared at the screen, the more the words seemed to grow heavier. Same time next week. I slowly placed the phone back into her purse and stepped away from the table as if it had become something dangerous. My first instinct was to march upstairs and confront her immediately. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear of hearing the truth out loud. Maybe it was the fragile hope that there was still some explanation I hadn't thought of yet. Instead, I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. The house felt different suddenly, like the walls were holding their breath. For the first time in years, I started replaying my entire marriage in my mind. Linda and I met when we were 25 years old at a 4th of July barbecue hosted by a mutual friend. She was standing near the lemonade table laughing at something someone had said, and I remember thinking her smile had a warmth that made everyone around her feel comfortable. We talked for hours that night. By the time the fireworks started, I already knew I wanted to see her again. 2 years later we were married in a small church with about 60 people in attendance. It wasn't a fancy wedding, but it felt perfect at the time. We didn't have much money in those days. I worked long hours at a hardware store, and Linda had just started a job at an insurance office downtown. But we were happy because we believed we were building something together. When Emily was born, everything changed. Suddenly our lives revolved around diapers, late-night feedings, and pediatrician appointments. 3 years later Daniel arrived, and the house became a whirlwind of toys, school projects, and soccer practices. Those were chaotic years, but they were also some of the happiest years of my life. Linda was an incredible mother. She attended every school play, every parent-teacher meeting, every game. She had a way of making our children feel like they were the most important people in the world. Somewhere along the way, though, things began to shift. It didn't happen all at once. It was subtle, almost invisible at first. Linda started staying late at work more often. She said the office had been short-staffed and she needed to help with extra paperwork. I believed her because Linda had always been responsible. Then she began going out with friends more frequently. Sometimes it was dinner with coworkers. Sometimes it was a book club meeting that seemed to happen every other week. None of it seemed suspicious at the time. But now, sitting alone in the living room with those messages echoing in my mind, I started wondering if those late nights had been something else entirely. About 30 minutes later I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. Linda walked into the living room wearing her robe and rubbing her temples like her headache hadn't gone away. When she saw me sitting there, she looked slightly surprised. "You're still up?" she asked. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. She sat down in the armchair across from me, and for a moment we talked about ordinary things. The weather. Emily's kids. A new restaurant that had opened downtown. Linda seemed calm, maybe even a little tired, but there was nothing in her voice that suggested guilt or nervousness. That made everything even more confusing. After a few minutes she said she was going back to bed and asked if I was coming upstairs soon. "Yeah," I said quietly. But I didn't move. I stayed there for almost an hour staring at the dark window while the rain continued to fall outside. Eventually I realized there was only one way to know the truth. The next morning, after Linda left for work, I walked over to the dining chair where her purse still sat. My hands felt strangely heavy as I picked it up. I knew that once I opened that phone there would be no going back. And deep down, I already had the terrible feeling that whatever I was about to discover would change the rest of my life forever. The next morning the house felt strangely normal, and that was almost the worst part. Sunlight was coming through the kitchen window, the coffee machine was humming the way it always did, and Linda was moving around the house preparing for work like it was any other Wednesday. She kissed me on the cheek before leaving and asked if I could call the plumber later about the slow leak under the sink. Her voice sounded calm, natural, completely ordinary. If I hadn't seen those messages the night before, I would have believed everything in our life was exactly the way it had always been. When the front door finally closed and her car pulled out of the driveway, the silence in the house felt heavier than it ever had before. I stood in the kitchen for a long time staring at the dining chair where her purse still sat. It looked harmless, almost innocent. Just a brown leather purse we had bought together during a weekend trip to Nashville 3 years earlier. At the time Linda had laughed and said she finally owned something nice enough to pass down to Emily someday. That memory made my chest tighten. I walked over slowly and picked it up. My hands were shaking more than I expected. I kept telling myself I might still be wrong about everything. Maybe the messages belonged to someone else. Maybe Michael was a coworker going through a divorce. Maybe Linda had simply been comforting a friend who was struggling. But another voice in the back of my mind kept repeating the same quiet question. Then why did she hide it? I pulled the phone out of the purse and held it in my hand. The screen lit up when I touched it. For a moment I just stared at the lock screen, realizing how strange it was that a device no bigger than my palm suddenly felt like the most dangerous object in my life. Linda had changed the passcode. That alone told me something was wrong. For years we had used the same 4 numbers to unlock each other's phones. It wasn't something we discussed often, it was simply part of the trust we shared. But now the old code didn't work. The screen flashed red and told me to try again. I felt a small wave of anger rising inside me. It wasn't explosive anger, not yet. It was the slow, heavy kind that builds when you realize someone you love may have been lying to you. I tried another combination. Then another. None of them worked. Finally I placed the phone back on the table and stepped away. For a moment I thought about leaving it alone. Maybe ignorance would be easier. Maybe I could pretend I had never seen those messages and continue living the quiet, predictable life Linda and I had built together. But deep down I already knew that was impossible. Once doubt enters a marriage, it spreads like a crack in glass. And it never stops growing. That afternoon I drove to the hardware store where I had worked for nearly 30 years. I wasn't supposed to start my shift until noon, but I needed something to distract my mind. The store smelled the way it always had, a mix of sawdust, metal, and old wood shelves that had been there longer than I had. Normally that smell felt comforting to me. That day it barely registered. My coworker Frank noticed something was wrong almost immediately. Frank had been working there even longer than I had, and he had the kind of personality that made him notice everything. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said while stacking paint cans. "Just a rough night," I replied. Frank leaned against the shelf and crossed his arms. "You know I've known you 20 years, right? That face usually means something's eating at you." I hesitated. Talking about my marriage felt like exposing something fragile to the open air. But Frank had been through 2 divorces himself, and if there was anyone who understood how complicated relationships could be, it was him. So I told him about the messages. I didn't give every detail, but I explained enough for him to understand why I was worried. Frank listened quietly, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he rubbed the back of his neck and let out a long breath. "I'm gonna be honest with you," he said. "Messages like that usually mean exactly what they sound like." His words landed heavier than I expected. "But maybe there's another explanation," I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to me. Frank looked at me for a moment before speaking again. "Maybe. But if you want the truth, you're probably gonna have to start looking for it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I rang up customers, restocked shelves, answered questions about power drills and garden tools, but my mind kept drifting back to the phone sitting on the kitchen table at home. By the time my shift ended, I had made a decision. I was going to find out who Michael was. That evening Linda came home around 6, carrying groceries and talking about how stressful work had been that day. She mentioned a new policy change at the office and complained about one of the younger employees who kept making mistakes with paperwork. I listened carefully, watching her face for any sign of deception. But Linda was always good at telling stories. Later that night she said she needed to step outside to take a phone call. That was unusual. Linda usually took calls right in the living room. But this time she walked onto the back porch and closed the sliding door behind her. I stayed on the couch pretending to watch television. Through the glass I could see her silhouette pacing slowly back and forth. Her voice was too quiet for me to hear clearly, but I noticed something in her posture that made my stomach tighten. She looked nervous. After about 10 minutes she came back inside and said it had been a coworker asking about a scheduling issue. I nodded, pretending to believe her. But something inside me had already shifted. That night after she fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My mind kept circling the same question over and over. Who was Michael? 3 days later I finally got my first answer. It happened by accident. Linda had left early that morning for what she said was a training seminar across town. Around noon I realized she had forgotten her tablet on the kitchen counter. Normally that wouldn't mean much, but when I picked it up the screen lit up automatically. And a notification appeared. It was an email. The sender's name made my heart stop. Michael Turner. My hands started shaking as I opened the message. The email was short. Yesterday was perfect. I still can't believe we've managed to keep this secret for so long. My chest felt like someone had dropped a weight onto it. But the next line was the one that truly changed everything. 30 years is a long time to wait for someone you love. I read the sentence again. And again. 30 years. Linda and I had been married for 27. Which meant one thing. Whatever this relationship was, it had started long before I ever walked into her life. And in that moment I realized something that scared me more than the idea of an affair. I might never have truly known my wife at all. For the rest of that afternoon I sat in the kitchen staring at Linda's tablet like it might suddenly explain everything on its own. The email from Michael Turner was still open on the screen, and the words refused to leave my mind. 30 years is a long time to wait for someone you love. 30 years. Linda and I had been married for 27. That meant whatever existed between them had started before our marriage, maybe even before we met. The thought made my stomach twist. For a long time I tried to convince myself there was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe Michael had been an old boyfriend from before our marriage. Maybe he had reached out recently and they were simply reminiscing about the past. People reconnect with old friends all the time. But the other messages I had seen didn't feel like nostalgia. They felt current. They felt alive. And the phrase, keeping this secret for so long, echoed in my head like a warning. That evening Linda came home later than usual. She said the seminar had run long and that traffic had been terrible. She looked tired, but there was something else in her expression too, a kind of quiet tension I hadn't noticed before. We ate dinner together at the kitchen table. The television played softly in the background from the living room. Linda talked about work again, about paperwork and office politics, about a coworker who had accidentally deleted an entire client file. I nodded in the right places. But inside my head I kept hearing the same sentence over and over. 30 years. After dinner Linda said she was going to take a shower. The moment I heard the bathroom door close upstairs, I walked into the bedroom and picked up her phone from the nightstand. My hands were steady this time. I tried the old passcode again. Still wrong. But then I remembered something Linda used to do years ago when the kids were little. Whenever she had to create a password for something, she often used dates that meant something to her. Birthdays. Anniversaries. Important moments. I typed in the date we first met. Nothing. Then our wedding anniversary. Still nothing. For a moment I almost gave up. But then another thought came to me. What if the password had nothing to do with me? I tried the year Emily was born. The screen unlocked instantly. My heart dropped. For several seconds I just stared at the home screen, realizing I had crossed a line I could never step back from. But it was too late for second thoughts now. I opened the message app. Michael's conversation was right at the top. And there were hundreds of messages. My chest tightened as I started scrolling. Some of them were short and harmless looking. Others weren't. I wish we could have chosen a different life back then. I still remember the night you left. I never stopped loving you. The messages went back months. But when I scrolled further, I noticed something even more disturbing. The conversation hadn't started recently. It stretched back years. 5 years. Maybe more. Linda and Michael had been talking almost every week. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to reveal itself. Michael Turner had been Linda's boyfriend before she met me. They had dated seriously in their early 20s. According to the messages, they had even talked about getting married. But something had happened. Something that caused Linda to leave him suddenly. One message from Michael stood out more than the others. I still remember the hospital hallway. You wouldn't even look at me. Hospital. My heart started beating faster as I continued reading. Another message. I know you thought leaving was the right choice. But we both know the truth about what happened. My hands felt cold. I kept scrolling. And then I found the message that made everything in my life shift beneath my feet. It was from 3 months earlier. Michael had written. He deserves to know the truth someday. Linda's reply came several minutes later. No. He can never know. It would destroy everything. For a long time I just sat there staring at those words. He deserves to know the truth. The question hit me like a sudden wave. Who was he? At first I assumed Michael meant me. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. If the secret was about their past relationship, why would Michael say I deserve to know? There had to be something else. Something bigger. And then I saw another message further down. It was from 2 weeks earlier. Michael had written. I saw him last month. He looks just like you did at that age. My chest tightened. Him. Not me. Someone else. I scrolled further. Linda had responded only one sentence. Please don't contact him again. The room felt suddenly smaller. My thoughts began racing through every possibility I could imagine. A nephew. A cousin. A coworker. But deep down a darker possibility was beginning to form in my mind. One I didn't want to believe. Just then I heard the shower turn off upstairs. Panic surged through me. I quickly locked the phone and placed it back on the nightstand exactly where it had been. Then I walked downstairs and sat on the couch pretending to watch television. A few minutes later Linda came down wearing her robe. She sat beside me and asked what I was watching. I told her it was just some old movie. For a moment we sat there in silence. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder the way she had done hundreds of times over the years. And suddenly I realized something that made my chest ache. Even now, even after everything I had seen, part of me still loved her. But another part of me had begun asking a question I was terrified to answer. If Michael had known Linda for 30 years. And if there was another man out there who looked just like he had when he was younger. Then what if the biggest secret in my marriage wasn't the affair? What if it was something else entirely? Something that had been hidden for decades. That night I barely slept. And sometime around 3 in the morning a single horrifying possibility finally formed clearly in my mind. What if Linda and Michael didn't just share a past? What if they shared a child? And what if that child had been living somewhere in the world for 30 years? Without ever knowing the truth about who his parents really were. That night I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed staring into the darkness while Linda breathed softly beside me, and the sound of her breathing felt strangely unfamiliar, as if the woman lying next to me was no longer the person I had shared my life with for 27 years. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the same words from the messages again. 30 years. He deserves to know the truth. I saw him last month. He looks just like you did at that age. By 3 in the morning my mind had already formed the possibility I was most afraid of. What if Linda and Michael had a child together? What if that child had been born before we ever met, and somehow that truth had been hidden for decades? The idea sounded almost impossible, but the more I thought about it, the more the pieces started fitting together in ways I didn't like. Linda and I met when we were 25. She had rarely talked about her life before that time. I knew the basic things, that she grew up in Ohio, that she moved to our town for work, that she had dated someone seriously in her early 20s but that it ended badly. Whenever the subject came up she usually brushed past it quickly and changed the conversation. Back then I had assumed it was just an old relationship she didn't like remembering. Now, lying awake in the dark, I started wondering if there had been much more to the story. The next morning I woke up feeling like I had aged 10 years overnight. Linda was already in the kitchen making coffee. She smiled when she saw me and asked if I had slept well. I forced a small smile and said I had been awake for a while thinking about work. She didn't question it. That was one of the strange things about long marriages. You learn how to move around each other's emotions without asking too many questions. Sometimes that's what keeps a relationship peaceful. Sometimes it's what hides the truth. After she left for work again I sat at the kitchen table for almost an hour trying to decide what to do next. Confronting her directly still felt impossible because I didn't know the full story yet. All I had were fragments. Messages. Suspicious sentences. Half-hidden clues. If I confronted her too early she could easily deny everything and erase whatever evidence remained. Part of me hated what I was about to do, but another part knew I needed answers more than I needed comfort. So I started searching. The first thing I did was look up Michael Turner online. It didn't take long to find him. There were dozens of people with that name, but one of them lived only about 40 minutes away in a neighboring town. His profile photo showed a man in his late 50s with gray hair and a tired but kind face. Something about his expression felt strangely familiar, though I couldn't explain why. I clicked through several public photos and saw pictures of a small landscaping business, a few family gatherings, and one photograph that made my stomach drop. In that picture, Michael was standing beside a young man who looked about 27 or 28 years old. The resemblance between them was obvious. They had the same eyes, the same narrow jaw, the same crooked half-smile. Under the photo was a caption: "Proud of my son, Ethan." I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. Ethan looked around the same age as our daughter Emily. If Linda had known Michael 30 years ago, the timing would match almost perfectly. I told myself it still didn't prove anything. People see patterns where they want to see them. But a quiet voice inside me kept whispering the same possibility. What if Ethan wasn't just Michael's son? What if he was Linda's too? The thought made my hands shake so badly that I had to close the laptop for a moment. The idea that my wife might have hidden an entire child from me felt almost too big to process. Yet the more I replayed the messages in my mind, the harder it became to ignore the possibility. For the next 2 days I moved through life like a man walking through fog. I went to work, answered customers, and talked with Frank about ordinary things, but my mind never left the question that had begun to consume me. Finally, on Friday afternoon, I made a decision that terrified me. I was going to meet Michael Turner. I didn't tell Linda anything. Instead, I drove to the neighboring town where his landscaping business was listed. The place was a modest property with a small office building and several trucks parked outside. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears as I stepped out of the car. For a moment I almost turned around and drove home. But something deeper than fear pushed me forward. When I walked into the office, a man looked up from behind a desk. He looked exactly like the photo I had seen online, only older and more tired. "Can I help you?" he asked. For a moment I couldn't speak. Then I forced the words out. "Are you Michael Turner?" He nodded slowly. I swallowed. "My name is David Carter." The moment he heard my name, something changed in his face. His eyes widened slightly and the color drained from his expression. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. "I was wondering when this day might come," he said quietly. Those words felt like a punch to the chest. "You know who I am," I said. Michael nodded again. "Linda's husband." Hearing my wife's name spoken by him made the room feel colder. I took a step closer to the desk. "I saw the messages," I said. "I need the truth." Michael rubbed his face with both hands like a man who had carried a heavy weight for too long. When he finally looked up again, his eyes were filled with something I didn't expect. "Regret." "What exactly do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything," I said. For a moment he hesitated. Then he gestured toward a chair across from the desk. I sat down slowly while my heart continued pounding in my chest. Michael was silent for a long time before he finally spoke again. "Linda and I were together when we were young," he began. "We thought we were going to spend our lives together. But things didn't turn out the way we planned. I waited." His voice became quieter. "When Linda got pregnant, everything changed." The words seemed to echo in the small office. My stomach tightened. "Her parents were very strict," Michael continued. "They believed a pregnancy before marriage would ruin her future. They forced her to leave town and stay with relatives until the baby was born. I felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared." "And the baby?" I asked slowly. Michael looked down at his hands. "Linda told everyone the child had been adopted." My throat felt dry. "But that wasn't the truth." Michael shook his head. "No," he said softly. "It wasn't. I leaned forward, barely able to breathe. Then where is the child? Michael looked at me with an expression filled with years of pain. I raised him, he said. The room fell completely silent. And in that moment the terrible possibility that had haunted my mind for days finally became reality. Somewhere in the world there was a man nearly 30 years old. A man who had lived his entire life without knowing the full truth about where he came from. A man who, by blood, might belong to both Michael Turner and my wife. But the question that shattered me the most came next. Because if Linda had hidden a child before our marriage, what else had she been capable of hiding all these years? And more importantly, did our own children know any part of the truth? For a long time after Michael said those words neither of us spoke. The silence in that small office felt heavy and suffocating, like the air itself had thickened. I sat there trying to process what he had just told me, but my mind kept rejecting it. The idea that my wife had carried a child before we met and had hidden that truth from me for almost 30 years felt impossible, and yet the look in Michael's eyes told me he wasn't lying. There was no anger in his face, no triumph, no sense that he was winning anything by telling me the story. What I saw instead was the tired honesty of a man who had been carrying a secret for decades and no longer had the strength to pretend it didn't exist. I asked him the question that had been sitting like a stone in my chest ever since I walked into that office. I asked him if Linda had known all these years that he had kept the child and raised him. Michael nodded slowly and said yes, she had always known. According to him, the plan had originally been for the baby to be adopted by another family, something Linda's parents insisted on because they believed it would protect her reputation and allow her to start a new life. But Michael had refused to let that happen. He said he couldn't stand the thought of his son growing up somewhere without knowing his real father. So after the birth he had taken the child himself and moved to another town to raise him. Linda had left shortly afterward, and according to Michael she had told him she needed to pretend the entire situation never happened if she was going to have any chance at building a normal life. As I listened to him speak I realized something that hurt almost as much as the secret itself. Linda had made a conscious decision to erase that part of her life. She had chosen to walk away not just from Michael, but from her own child. I asked Michael if she had ever tried to contact their son over the years. He said she had written a few letters in the early days but eventually stopped because she believed it would only make things harder for everyone involved. He told me that a few years ago they had started speaking again after reconnecting online. That was when their conversation slowly turned into something emotional again, something neither of them had planned but both of them had clearly been carrying inside for decades. When I asked about the recent meetings between them, Michael didn't deny it. He admitted they had seen each other a handful of times over the past year, mostly to talk about the past and about whether their son deserved to finally know the truth about his mother. He insisted that nothing physical had happened between them, that their relationship was complicated but not an affair in the way I might imagine. Normally I would have dismissed a statement like that as an excuse, but something in the way he spoke made it difficult to accuse him of lying. He seemed almost ashamed of the entire situation, as though he knew that every step he took toward Linda was also a step deeper into a mess that could hurt many people. I eventually asked him the question that had been haunting me ever since I saw that photograph online. I asked him about his son Ethan. Michael looked surprised that I already knew the name, but he confirmed that Ethan was indeed the child Linda had given birth to all those years ago. Ethan was 29 years old now and worked as a mechanic not far from where Michael lived. According to Michael, Ethan believed his mother had died shortly after he was born. That lie had been told to protect Linda's new life, the life that eventually included me and the family we built together. When I heard that part of the story, something inside me cracked in a way I can't fully describe. I had spent 27 years believing my marriage was built on honesty and partnership, and now I was sitting in a small office learning that the foundation of that marriage had been constructed over a secret so large it had its own life. I asked Michael if Ethan had ever suspected the truth. Michael said no, not until recently. Apparently Ethan had started asking questions about his past after noticing inconsistencies in old family records. That was when Michael and Linda began discussing whether the truth should finally come out. I left Michael's office in a kind of emotional fog. The drive home felt longer than it should have, and the entire time I kept replaying our conversation in my head. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was already setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the front yard. For several minutes I stayed in the car staring at the house where Linda and I had raised our children, the house that had always felt like the safest place in my world. Now it looked unfamiliar somehow, as if the walls were hiding something I had never noticed before. When I finally walked inside, Linda was standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. She smiled when she saw me and asked how my day had been. For a moment I simply looked at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the person Michael had described. She looked the same as she always had, calm and warm and familiar, yet now I could see the weight she had been carrying behind that familiar face. I told her we needed to talk. Something in my voice must have told her this conversation would not be easy because she immediately put the knife down and turned toward me with a serious expression. I asked her one simple question. I asked if she had ever had a child before we met. For a moment her entire body went still, and in that silence I saw the truth long before she said a word. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table and covered her face with her hands. When she finally looked up again there were tears in her eyes. She admitted everything. She told me about the pregnancy when she was 23, about the pressure from her parents, about the fear that her life would be ruined before it had even begun. She said she believed giving the child up was the only way to escape the judgment of the people around her and start over somewhere new. When I asked why she never told me the truth after we married, she said she was afraid I would see her differently, afraid that the past would destroy the future we were trying to build. Listening to her confession felt like watching two versions of my life collide. On one hand I understood the fear and desperation she must have felt as a young woman facing that situation. On the other hand I couldn't ignore the fact that she had kept the truth hidden from me for nearly 3 decades. The betrayal wasn't just about secrecy, it was about the years we had spent together believing we knew everything important about each other. Then I asked her about Ethan. When I said his name her face collapsed completely. She began crying in a way I had never seen before, the kind of deep, uncontrollable crying that comes from years of buried guilt. She told me she had followed his life from a distance through Michael, always wanting to reach out but never believing she had the right to disrupt the life he had built without her. She said that reconnecting with Michael recently had reopened all the feelings she had tried to bury for years. I asked her the question that mattered most to me at that moment. I asked whether she still loved Michael. Linda shook her head immediately and said the love she felt for him now was different from what it once was. According to her, their recent meetings were about unfinished history, about facing the truth they had both avoided for decades. She insisted that the life she had built with me and our children was real and meaningful to her. She said she never intended to betray me, but she also admitted that keeping such a massive secret had been unfair to everyone involved. We sat there talking for hours as the night grew darker outside. At some point the anger I had been carrying began to shift into something more complicated. I realized that the real tragedy of the situation wasn't just the secret itself but the years of fear and silence that had allowed it to grow larger than it ever needed to be. By the time the clock on the wall showed nearly midnight, one thing had become clear to both of us: the truth about Ethan could no longer stay hidden. 2 weeks later we drove together to Michael's house to meet him and his son. I had imagined that moment many times, but nothing prepared me for the reality of it. Ethan was standing in the driveway when we arrived, and the moment I saw his face I understood why Michael had once written that he looked like Linda when she was young. The resemblance was unmistakable. When Linda stepped out of the car, Ethan stared at her with a mixture of confusion and recognition that seemed almost instinctive. The conversation that followed was emotional and messy and far from perfect. Michael explained the history slowly while Linda struggled to speak through tears. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger to something quieter and more reflective. At one point he walked away for several minutes, leaving the rest of us standing in the yard in silence. When he finally returned he looked directly at Linda and asked her why she had waited so long. Linda didn't try to defend herself. She simply told him the truth, that she had been young and afraid, and that every year she waited to tell him made it harder to face the consequences of that decision. For a long time Ethan said nothing. Then he sighed and said something I will never forget. He said that the past couldn't be changed, but the future still belonged to the people willing to face the truth. That day didn't magically fix everything. There were still wounds, still complicated emotions, still relationships that would take time to rebuild. But something important happened in that moment. The secret that had shaped so many lives for so many years finally lost its power. What replaced it wasn't perfect happiness, but something more honest. Months later, as I look back on everything that happened, I realized the hardest lesson of my life came from that experience. Marriage isn't just about love or loyalty, it's about the courage to be fully honest with the person who shares your life. Secrets might feel like protection in the moment, but over time they grow into walls that separate people who were meant to stand side by side. Linda and I are still working through the damage that secret caused, and some days are harder than others. But at least now we are facing the truth together, and sometimes that's the only way a broken story can begin to heal.